Carla, we've obviously switched into our like fall vibe with Cup of Joy Cafe.
You already know. It's funny because I didn't know you're gonna be. I call it a beanie. I didn't know you were gonna be wearing a beanie, and
O cap, whatever you want to call it.
it's meant to be.
It is meant to be. Good to see you.
My gosh, nice to see you too. It's been a while.
Happy Wednesday. Wink.
Happy Wednesday.
I mean, everybody, you're on Survivor. I mean, whatever, it's happening now, all right. So I'm like, you don't have to talk about it, but it's Wednesday, and we get excited about Wednesdays for that reason.
Yes.
Fun fact about you: you're on Survivor. Not so fun fact about me. I used to work in standardized assessment.
Okay. I love it. I love that you are no longer there.
I mean, there are, when you think about assessment practices, Big Picture does assessment practices, right? We have exhibitions. There are ways that we assess learning. So
learning plans.
I think sometimes assessment has a bad word, especially when you sort of add the standardized to the front of it.
Exactly.
Right? Standardized assessment. You can't be one student at a time and then force all those students to take the same assessment. In my opinion.
I 100% agree with you. Yeah.
And I think the data would suggest that's true too, because over and over again, what we find in assessment practices, standardized assessment practices, more often than not, it's a measure of parental wealth than it is. It correlates more strongly with parental wealth than it does with things like where you attended school. All right. I'm going deep down the well.
And I'm wondering why you're bringing this up.
Okay, so we're going to talk today with our colleague, Andrea Purcell, because we're going to talk about an assessment practice that's starting to happen more widely across the Big Picture network called the International Big Picture Learning Credential, which started in Australia. I'm pretending like I know a lot about it. I'm learning about it, but I'd love to have our viewership learn more about it through our colleague, Andrea. So, Andrea, welcome.
Welcome, Andrea.
Hey, Carla. Hey, Chris. I do not have my fall beanie on because it's supposed to be 95 in Los Angeles today.
Cold. All right, I'm gonna tee you up. So I was just in another meeting with you about the Ibplc, and you said this. This is not, I paraphrased. This has the opportunity to be astronomical in its impact. I mean, hyperbole? I don't know. Why do you say that?
I mean, you know, Chris, because you've been involved in standardized assessment practices, and you know, we all three of us were educated in the United States. The evaluation and assessment system in the United States is both high stakes and big money, and it drives a lot of the kinds of things that happen in our schools. So the things that determine your funding, your allocation of resources, are necessarily things that as a school leader and as a school practitioner, you have to pay attention to those things, because you can't function in the public school sector if you don't have money and resources in order to do things. So if somebody's saying you have to achieve a certain score on a test, or you have to make a certain gain, and this is the only measure that you can use, that's necessarily impactful. You have to, in some way, think about that in terms of how you're preparing students and how you're integrating that assessment into the practice and sort of the functioning of your school. So if we can insert an assessment system, an evaluation system that is valid and reliable, that has both internal from a practice perspective and external facing value for what students want to do post-secondary, either the workforce or going into universities. And if that assessment tool is aligned to the things that we have seen over the past 25 plus years are the actual measures that matter to our students' success post-secondary, then we will have made a tremendous impact on the education system in the United States. So this work has the potential to be incredibly powerful. We're already seeing the power as it's facilitated and executed with our colleagues in Big Picture Australia and in other places in our network around the world. And we're super excited to be considering how we can integrate this into an American context.
I want to throw something on the screen, because it's actually the reason that we invited you here today. Tomorrow, I mean, there's only so much we can talk about in 12 minutes, but tomorrow there's actually a longer discussion about the IBPLC that everyone's invited to. So I'm just going to have this scroll during our discussion. If you want to register for that, I know Bitly links are not always great, but it'll scroll. So anyway, just put that up there so folks want to learn more. Carla?
Yep.
Do we, and before, I asked to kind of see an example of this, but does this exist in the US yet? Or is this like what we're working on now?
Yeah, so we are in our second year of a pilot implementation of the IBPLC. So we have our big picture colleagues, Lauren Demarudis and Casey Lamb, began doing this work, training advisors and actually working with students using the IBPLC last school year. So we have small pilot clusters, both in the Pacific Northwest and also in New York. This year, we're expanding the pilot to both within both of those regions, but also in Los Angeles. So we expect that there will be about 150 students who are participating, interacting with the IBPLC this year. Just to give some sort of framing for that, the IBPLC is a credential, and it's administered after a student has been vetted via the credential in 3 what is called moderations. And they're usually about 1 semester of space between each of the moderations. So in Big Picture Australia, students are evaluated at the end of the US equivalent of 11th grade, and then mid 12th grade and the end of 12th grade. We're considering whether that timeline aligns well with the US system that's part of the pilot. But after that 3rd moderation, a student is issued the IBPLC as a credential, like a diploma.
But is this in addition to like a high school diploma? Or is this?
It doesn't have to be.
Okay.
It doesn't have to be. So, I mean, that's part of the process. I think, while we're piloting it, there's going to need to be some parallel bookkeeping that's happening.
Yeah.
But the idea is that this is actually the credential that's issued, similar to, for example, an international baccalaureate. So if you have a framework for understanding that, this would be a similar effort.
Cool. Do we have an example, Chris? I think we might have an example of what it looks like.
Let me throw this up and maybe change the. I'm just gonna play around a little bit with it. All right, there we go. Andrew, go ahead.
No, I was
going to talk through the different components that you can see here.
Sure.
Okay, so this is a dashboard presentation of the IBPLC, and I mean that by saying this is an external facing representation of a tremendous amount of information that can be garnered and that is behind what this dashboard presentation looks like. So I'll just talk you through 4 different components, 4 different places that you can get access and information about a student. Let me talk first about the most colorful section over here, the part that looks like a flower and that has these little boxes that are color-coded that are next to it. For those of you who are familiar with Big Picture Schools and our learning goals and outcomes, some of this will sound very familiar. If you're not, Big Picture aspires to have students work toward competency in the US, typically in 5 areas. You'll notice that there's 6. Big Picture Australia added a 6th goal of competency. That's the orange one. Those goal areas are quantitative reasoning, quantitative reasoning, empirical reasoning, communications, personal qualities, social reasoning. And then the added area is knowing how to learn. So I would imagine, Carla, this sounds familiar to you as a Big Picture alumni, that these are the kinds of areas you might talk about in your exhibition or that you might look at in your ILP. You might set goals around these. This is a visual representation of a student's current progress level out of a 5-point scale in those Big Picture goal areas. Behind this, the way that you get to this area is an advisor and a student work together. They choose, and you'll see a link down in the lower left-hand corner to an online portfolio. They choose their best work, 3 pieces of evidence for each one of the different learning goal areas. Those are the pieces of work that are vetted in order to determine by the advisor and the student what the current student's level of progression is. I'd like to point out that Big Picture Australia does not consider or advocate for everybody trying to achieve a 5 by the end of their high school experience in these particular areas. In fact, achieving a level 2 is approximately equivalent to what a high-performing high school student a secondary student would have achieved, or we would expect them to achieve in order to predict success post-secondary in the workforce and in the university. So I think it's important to level set. And when folks have an opportunity to dig deeper into the frames, you can see that like actually function at level 5 is really high level, even for some adults who've been in their career field for a really long time. So we talked about the curated digital online portfolio that contains the evidence that leads to the evaluation on the flower in terms of the big picture goals. You'll also see that there's a link next to the online portfolio for a video statement. So you see a screen capture up above of a student, just her face. If you click on the video statement, you can actually hear a 3 to 4 minute video of the student introducing herself around her interests, her aspirations, her accomplishments, that sort of thing. So you get to hear it directly from a student in her own words. We know our students are powerful advocates for themselves, super articulate, especially if their communication, which is the blue flower, is up at a higher level. So you can hear directly from them. Below that, the text that's above those two hot links on the dashboard is an abbreviated autobiographical statement. That some of our students in our schools will write 80, 100, 200-page autobiographies. Mm-hmm. That's not here. We have an abbreviated version of that so that you can hear a little bit about the student. And then the fourth component that you can see on the dashboard is right below the flower. That's just it's like a resume. That's like the list of the students' accomplishments. But you'll notice that because we are big picture educators and we know real workplace learning and real world learning is really important, that we encourage there to be a list of the kinds of internships and workplace learning opportunities that a student has participated in. So there's a whole ton, like a depth and complexity that is embodied in this particular snapshot that I think is really exciting.
That is exciting. Ooh, like I said, I think a 12-minute conversation does not lend itself to the sort of depth of this topic. So I want folks to know, as I'd mentioned before, there's a webinar tomorrow. But Andrea, if I recall, you've been doing these semi-regularly. So if you can't make it the last minute, there's probably going to be more. Also, I noticed today, because South by Southwest EDU sent out their programming today, I believe I saw a session from Andrea Purcell on that program, right?
Yep. So yes, you're right. We have general informational sessions about the Ibplc that happen once a month at approximately the third Thursday of every month that I know throw out in our leadership blasts and try to get out. Everybody's invited. They're not exclusive to Big Picture Network folks. So anyone can come and ask their questions and get sort of a general overview. We also have a series of more specific practitioner-based workshops that happen approximately the first Thursday of every month that is around how you build the foundations in your practice. Because remember, like the Ibplc is representative of the kind of experience a student has in a robust big picture learning style program. So if you're not doing that kind of activity in your schools, this is, that needs to be addressed. So those workshops are also available for folks to come and show up to. Next week, Tanya and some other folks, including Gabby from our school at Beyond the Box in the Netherlands, are speaking, and myself are speaking on a panel about the Ibplc at the Aurora Institute symposium. We have South by Southwest. I'm sure there's other things I'm not remembering. We're trying to be all over the place, so lots of people can hear about this.
I just want to say, because I think a lot of times folks on the show, we take for granted that everyone knows who we're talking about. Tanya is from Big Picture Australia.
Yes.
So I want to shout her out as well.
Yes.
Whoo. Okay. It feels so weird to conclude this, but that's our time.
The work is ongoing, so
more to come, a lot more to come.
There's no conclusion, not right now.
There really is not. So Andrea, thank you for joining us today. Really appreciate your time. And back to work. Get back to the astronomical impact on the future of assessment and education.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, you bet.
See ya.
Ooh, Carla, what'd you learn?
What did I learn? That my method of learning, my mode of learning is changing the world. It's still going. It really makes me think about what the future of assessments assessments can look like, especially when we talk about a post-COVID, right? Like, did you learn anything? Because especially with universities going test optional, like we know that standardized assessments don't really work. So what have we taken away from this 2.5 year period? How are we gonna anyway? Yes, that's yeah. And I'm here at equity fellows too, so like a lot of the work is just like, what's next? What can we do? How can we push this? So
and one thing we don't talk a lot about, and I want to give credit to the work here, is that there's something to be said about the aesthetic beauty and design of an assessment, especially when you think about who is going to be looking at this and reading it. There's a lot to be said about design science and what that means too about interpretation of data. So
for
I always
sure.
want to make sure we shout out the design aesthetic too of the work that goes into this. So.
Yeah, that made me like, when you think about test scores, you think about like, I don't know, like a bar graph.
Yeah.
I think of always looking at what's the highest and what's the lowest and never like what's in the middle. But here it's like colorful and you can't really tell what the lowest is. I don't know if there's like a really low, but yeah, I appreciate that too.
All right, so that will do it. Next week, we have a conversation with a recent graduate of Big Picture School, as well as she also is a former, I don't know if they're ever called former, but she was a Harbor Freight Fellow as well, our colleague, Maddie Gillespie. So we'll be talking to her next week.
Gotcha. Yes, we will.
as you know.
As
all right.
I know. With that, can I close? Should I close?
Do it.
All right. Folks, make it a great day or not. The choice is yours, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.